very much. I'll stand because I realise sitting I can't see you at the back, so I hope that's okay with the gadgetry on the front. Well, thank you for that introduction. It seems a long time ago that I was at Edinburgh, but I suppose while I was there doing the applied work and working with developers, it reminded me that there was a project manager from Scottish Power who always used to greet me every time he saw me with his joke about what's new in archaeology then, which would make him roar with laughter. And tonight I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about what's maybe new in the archaeology of the Neolithic in the south of Jordan. It's always a bit difficult talking to an audience you don't know, because I have no idea how many of you know anything about the Neolithic. Some of you I know a lot about the Neolithic. Some of you know about Jordan. So excuse me if bits of it are too basic, bits of it aren't basic enough, but we'll just go ahead and see what happens. The Neolithic, famously first known from Kathleen Kenyon's excavations at Jericho. Not the first Neolithic excavation, but the first time it really hit the media back in Britain, in the 1950s, with Kathleen Kenyon digging up Neolithic sites, and most famously of all, Jericho and this large tower, right from the very start of the Neolithic, which to some extent has been reinterpreted, reanalyzed, looked at again, over and over again over the years, and it lurks at the back of our memory, and we often actually forget about it. Each generation sort of picks up a different theme to go with it. Here it's being used as a sort of astronomical centre. It has various ritual ascriptions given to it and so on. So it's many different interpretations over the years for this large structure right at the beginning of the Neolithic. The critical thing is that this built environment happens before farming begins. And this is one of the things I think wasn't realised at the time particularly, and it's one of the most important parts of the Neolithic. We all associate the Neolithic with the beginning of farming, beginnings of, if you like, a modern way of life, and move away from hunter-gatherers and so on. So we don't associate the early Neolithic of Jericho with our conventional image of what comes before farming, hunter-gatherer, the idea of sort of grubbing around for wild resources and so on. Clearly, a town like Jericho, that can't conceivably be happening. So we go with a sort of generic image of farmers. This is a reconstruction done by one of our project team at a site called Dra, down near the edge of the Dead Sea in the south of Jordan. You can see the mountains behind going up to the Kerak Plateau. And of course the inspiration for this and the general conception we all have in our heads when we talk about farmers are, at least perhaps not modern farmers, but traditional farming in the region. These are farmers from the early part of the 20th century in Palestine. And we're still very much indebted to Gordon Childe for the sort of model that we have of how the Neolithic happened. The idea of a revolution. I mean, Gordon Childe was a Marxist historian, firm believer in the idea of revolution, and the idea that everything happens fairly rapidly and all happens together. It's not just the idea that there's a change to an agricultural economy based on domesticated plants and animals, but there's a number of other things that are absolutely in lockstep with that. The idea of new types of tools, particularly famously pottery, comes in the Neolithic. All sorts of other economic things, the storage of food. If you're a farmer, you have to be able to store your food, you have to be able to redistribute it. You're no longer hunting different resources through the course of the year, but relying on major harvests. The great belief that there was a huge boom in population with the Neolithic, with people becoming more sedentary, spacing between birth reduced length of weaning and so on, all leading to an increase in population. And much of that, as I said, based on this idea that people are living settled down lives, and they've started to live in villages. And the idea of village is something we'll come back to again, because it's quite an important sort of mindset that we have about how farmers live, whether in the past or the present. And with all that, of course, when you start to have people living in larger groups, increasingly permanent manner, and you've got stored goods and so on, you start to require new social mechanisms for managing how you live together, how you don't keep falling out and having to move away, and how you deal with the idea of property and ownership and privacy. And going with all that, there's a sort of a boom, it appears, in symbolic behaviour, and a whole range of artefacts and things, the beginnings perhaps of shrines and so on, as people become at least more material in their expression of their ritual and religious ideas. So a lot of things all supposed to be happening in fairly close step together in the sort of child idea. Now this is the most boring slide you can imagine. This is the cultural historical sequence of the period we're talking about, starting with people who everyone would agree are probably hunter-gatherers, the early Natufian, going right up to the pottery Neolithic, but through a whole sequence of Natufians and early pottery Neolithic A's and B's and so on. The important point about this is that the sequence takes about 8,000 years. So the Neolithic revolution takes longer than most of us could really imagine in terms of time, which is a very important aspect of what's going on. If you look at all the different changes sort of mapped out in diagrammatic form, you can see this goes back to like 22,000 years ago, and you can see how some of them begin to come in, the groundstone, the beginnings of building and so on, going right up to the end where you've really got farming happening. So we have in the beginning, for the first thousands of years, definitely got hunter-gatherers, and at the end we've definitely got farmers. And the bit that we're interested in is this roughly 8,000 year slot in the middle, where, as you can see from all the little arrows densely there, the bulk of the innovation and change is happening. There's certainly a lot going on, but it's not happening overnight. It's happening over this extended period. And we have the Natufian period I mentioned, the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, and the pre-pottery Neolithic B period. Rather arcane terms, dreamt up by archaeologists, but if I tell you what they are now, then at least when I accidentally mention them as we go through the talk, they may mean something to you. But you can see the way all of these things happen at different rates, different speeds, and not entirely in lockstep and parallel. One of the key things to note is you've got all this development of storage technology, development of architecture and so on, happening before you get the plant domestication, the animal domestication. And that's why I want to talk about the idea of building a sense of community, because that actually seems to be a major driver for the economic changes. And part of it comes back to this idea of what people are actually becoming, what are people actually changing into. We have this sort of generic idea of farmers that we all hold in our minds, but there's no reason to assume that Neolithic farmers were anything that we recognise now. Farming and the lifestyles that people lead and how they live them and how sedentary they are and so on is extremely variable across the world. And the sort of people that we have from the Neolithic were probably doing something entirely different. There have been very, very few occasions in the world where farming has really been invented from scratch. Most of the world has adopted it as a process of expansion, colonization, and so on. And there are only a limited number of places in the world where it's really developed from the beginning. And that's one of the key things about Southwest Asia, about the Levant and Jordan and so on, is that this is one of the few places where people really change themselves across this lengthy period. And here's the bit of Southwest Asia that generally concerns us, the so-called Fertile Crescent, and you can see going all the way across from the Zagros Mountains in Iran, and coming right down to the southern tip of the Levant, and not really showing up on this particular map, but it comes down in the Jordanian mountains, the Mediterranean woodland zone, the area where a lot of the wild progenitors of the domesticated plants and animals live and grow. Now, when I started talking about the processes of change, I went back to about 22,000. And we certainly have people beginning to build more sophisticated shelters and structures by then. And people quite often like to see these as the forebears of Neolithic architecture. The important aspects of them is these are residences, these are huts where people live, but they're basically just shelters. A lot of it's brushwood, small scoops in the ground and so on with the hearth. It's not really architecture as we know it, even from the time we get into the Natufian, this period about 14,000 years ago, where this photograph you can see there with the crazy paving floors, the large mortars you can probably make up. There's a large mortar for grinding seeds up in. Quite a lot of effort and investment in time and place has gone into this. So although these people are still living entirely on wild resources, they've begun to tether themselves to the landscape in certain ways, where presumably there are resources that they can rely on, they can go back to, or stay while the resources flourish. And the investment in the architecture is becoming quite different from what we know from hunter-gatherer times. Now, just to place us within the southern Levant, usually treated as a single entity when we're looking at archaeology, but there's actually quite a number of different sort of provinces from the Galilee, the West Bank, northern Jordan, and the area I'm going to talk about most tonight, the south of Jordan. where over recent years, and this is where the archaeology starts to become a little new, there's been an incredible amount of research happening. We have, in the early PPNA, this early phase, we've got the sites of W16, excavated by me and my colleague at the back there, Stephen Mython. The site of Dra, excavated, I excavated that with Ian Kite from Notre Dame University of America. And these have completely revolutionised our picture of southern Jordan, which until this point was seen as a very ephemeral area, right on the edge of whatever could be happening, too arid, too distant from the centre, and beyond the pale. And then they go on into the late PPNA, Barrow 16 continues occupation, but other sites start to come in, El Hemmer in the centre there, which I'll mention later. And the middle PPNB, well known from the site of Beda, excavated by Diana Kirkbride, who'd excavated with Kenyon at Jericho. And the site more recently excavated by a Danish team at Stowett Mazed, very close together, and very typical of the south of Jordan in some ways, in that they're very different from the rest of the Neolithic world. Now, we talked about demographic explosions and what happens when people settle down. This is the late PPNB, and you can see from the number of dots that the number of sites has increased enormously. The population has clearly gone up. And these sites, as I'll show you later, are quite different. These are dense, large. When they were first discovered, they were even seen as sort of proto-urban settlements. So they reflect a huge increase in population base. And then finally, the pottery Neolithic, the period when farming is really beginning to get developed. The number of sites in the south of Jordan declines. I'm not going to say very much about the pottery Neolithic tonight because that's sort of the end of the process. I'm more interested in the settling down and building community process that goes on before that. But it's maybe worth saying that these sort of maps are always a bit illusory, and probably what's happening at this stage, once people have started to farm, is that these large settlements disappear because people are distributing themselves differently in the landscape in smaller farming sites and so on. So what is the nature of the evidence we have? These are a pair of sites, one from the very sort of final hunting and gathering period of the Natufian, the Harifian variant of it, and one from very early Neolithic, the PPNA. And as you can see, they look very, very similar. It's a very smooth process of transition to begin with. They have the mortars in the middle of their floors. They're dug into the ground, so you've got semi-subterranean structures. The edges of those semi-subterranean structures are lined with rubble walls, but it's very clear if you look at those walls, you can't really build any superstructure on this. They are not that different perhaps from the earlier shelters where people are building very, very basic shelters to live in. The difference on the Neolithic one, and this is at Fanan, it's the same structure as you saw last one, but the difference here is there's the cut hole mortar that's typical for both the hunter-gatherer and the Neolithic sites in the floor. But here you can see that there's layer after layer of pale material, and those are floors. People are living here much longer, much more continuously, coming back again and again. We've got evidence from the soil micromorphology that they're probably sweeping these floors, keeping them clean and maintaining it, redoing the floor. There's a much greater sense of permanence and settlement at the site than there is at any of the preceding Harifian sites. Also, they're doing something which becomes quite well known in the Neolithic. They're burying people under the floor. This isn't cut through the floor initially, this is actually buried as a foundation, as one of the first things that happens on the site, and then the floors start to accumulate above it. But they leave it marked, invisible, and they go back in. There's only one skull you can see there, but there's actually the long bones of many more than one person. So they're going back in, they're rearranging the bones, they're taking bones out, putting bones back in. Of course, we don't know what their beliefs about this were, but it's very tempting to see there's some sort of ancestry, some sort of idea of ownership of the building, something that gives the building some sort of longevity that's attached to people, and the living and the dead clearly not entirely separated from each other conceptually. I mentioned this idea of the village that always goes with farmers. These are sites, well, this is one site, in fact, from the West Bank, Negev and Dud, and this is typical of most of the sites of the West Bank. Collections are fairly similar, relatively ephemeral structures, all rather similar one to another, and they look like they're probably some sort of shelter that's a bit more developed than the hunter-gatherer ones, but not much, not very different, fairly lightweight structures. but they do indeed seem to form collections that might be described as villages. And we often find people looking at modern or traditional villages as analogues to these things and describing the life of people within the same sort of framework. And also noticing in the Neolithic how these sites are very sharply defined in the landscape. That's the site of Beda up there on the right, and you can see that it's very, very densely packed architecture, and it just comes to an end. It doesn't spread across the landscape, and that's partly because it's got a wall around bits of it. It doesn't seem to be a defensive wall, it's got steps going up it. It's low, easy to step over, and it may simply be part of the architectural way of keeping the whole site together. The site's in sand, and the wall may just be actually stopping too much tumble around the edges of the site. And you see this as you go into the later PPMB, when instead of expanding outwards, they actually start to build upwards. The sites become even more dense, but vertically arranged. For some reason, and perhaps because of the identity of the community wanting to keep together, they're not expanding across the landscape. They're keeping their sites very, very densely packed and built up. Now, the site we excavated at Dra, and this is where that reconstruction image of people harvesting wild cereals is from. You can see the mountains going up. That goes up to the Carrick Plateau there. And the site is just over there. A shade, it's very close to the Dead Sea and very, very hot and nasty to work there. And that's some of the patterns of shade you can see across the photograph here. But what we uncovered wasn't the same as in the West Bank at all. What you can see there are rows and rows of upright stones with notches in the tops of them. Now, they're one phase of architecture. And you can see with this one in the front, you can see there's a stone wall going around the back. That's a different phase of architecture. Down underneath them, there's a stone mortar in the floor, another phase of the architecture. But the stone uprights were something entirely new to us. What they seem to have been doing is holding up wooden beams on them to suspend floors above the ground. And we think they're for storing cereals in them. We have silica phytoliths in the mud on the floors in great density from cereals, probably barley. We've got barley chaff in the mud plaster of the floors and the walls. So it looks like these are very early granaries of some sort, which is interesting because, again, much as the Tower of Jericho before farming, here they are storing cereal crops before farming. They're managing to intensify the wild stands of barley sufficient that they can get a good enough crop off them just by tending and cultivating them to produce a stored crop. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that these stores don't reflect what was generally perceived to be the case. Once you start to harvest things, you're beginning to develop ideas of ownership and stopping all the traditional hunting-gathering things of sharing. These are placed out centrally in the community, and it looks like they're deliberately made to be visible, so people can see people going in and out of the stores, people know what's going on. Perhaps they're still sort of enforcing sharing of the harvest. It's not yet reached the point where there seems to be any idea of private property. Now that's one sort of the building we have at Dra, but it's not the only sort of building there is. Here's another one, and you can maybe see there's a ring of holes which have big posts in them. Then there's a low mud wall going round, and then there's a mud plaster floor and a mortar in the centre. The low mud wall around the edge, you can maybe see there's little stake holes running around it, and a burnt clay face on the inside. And we think this is a wattle and daub wall, you know, where you put up a lightweight organic screen and then stick mud to it to make it a lightweight wall. So it's got a little screen wall around it, and probably the big post holes around are holding up the roof of some sort. And these are reused several times with these large mortars put into the floor, and then when, at some point, for no reason that we know, a new floor is put in with a new mortar put in above it. And these buildings seem to be lightweight structures designed for processing food. There are also cutting slabs and other such features on the floor. Not really any room for doing anything else apart from working around these set tools. So it looks like these are another special purpose building. So we've now got two sorts of building with very particular purposes, and both of them set into the centre of the community. In the area of the site we've got a third type of building, revetted into the slope of the hill, which is largely made of the rubbish that is accumulating around them. And these ones we think might be residences. They're a bit more well built, a bit more solid, slightly larger, so perhaps we have here the residence. But it's a very different picture from what we saw in the West Bank, and a very different picture from our idea of sort of a traditional farming village with houses, with everything kept inside the house, all the private food and things kept inside the house. Different form of community design. People are building their settlements in quite a different manner. They're also, unlike the idea that everything carries on in succession all the time, they swap the land around a lot. So in this we can see a sequence where we've got a mud wall building above, a building with the stone uprights for the raised floor, and below that are the stone wall buildings. So each individual plot is not being held by some sort of descent group or lineage, but they're actually moving and reorganising the community a lot of the time. So quite flexible still, despite the fact that we're seeing modern stone architecture. The community can still readjust itself, realign itself, perhaps as different people come and go and so on. It's not quite the permanent community that we understand from fully sedentary societies. If we go on further south to Wadi Fanan, and here's our site of 16, you can see this low mound here. That's not a natural mound, that's actually it's a very early, quite small tell where we've got at least 3 metres of Neolithic PPNA material accumulating. Here again, we have a wide variety of different forms of building. There is no indication of standard architectural forms, although you can see that in a way they all share various architectural traits. They all still seem to be semi-subterranean, they're dug into the ground, and they're all lined, you can make out a slightly red tint to it, with mud pisé. So there's a basic sort of architectural unity, but within that there are a lot of different forms. So we have the very sort of basic one here, which as you can see is not that different from the earlier ones, with cup hole mortars set in the floor. The floors, they're more solid than the previous ones, but it's still just mud plaster. There's no lime or anything in that. So this perhaps is one of our residential buildings. But there are other forms of building. There's this one here with the division into 1/3 and 2/3. And if we look at that in the course of excavation, you can see here there's a layer which appears to be the mud plaster floor with the cup hole mortar in it, in the fairly conventional way. But also, just poking through here, you can see some of these upright stones with the notches in them. So here they've dug down and they've done the really hard work of digging out that pit, and then as it accumulates different floor horizons and so on, it's changing function. Starting off as a store with these stones, and then becomes perhaps a residence or a food processing area with the mud plaster floor. And we've got this building here, this strange internal cell here with its own subdivisions inside it. This one's particularly well preserved because it burnt down, so as we excavated it, you can see that there's the remains of the roof that have come down, and that's protected the layers of flooring and so on below it. And we've got, and this was just us playing on site, we've got the notch stones here, but they're arranged radially around the internal cell, but it seems to have a raised floor. And I should have said, of course, and you're probably all aware, that raised floors are very useful for granaries and things, because you're keeping the rodents and things away to some extent. And if, as we suspect at this period, it's a lot more damp, you're keeping your storage up, away from the water. So there's a sort of circumstantial reasons for arguing that they're granaries as well as what we're finding within them. For now, we've got other forms of building as well. Here's a little workshop, and you can see here this little anvil here with the holes in it for putting in beads while you're drilling out the centres to make beads. So again, more specialised architecture. So we're getting a real range of buildings built for specific purposes. And at the end of the settlement, right overlooking the Wadi, is this really large building. It's not as spectacular as the Tower of Jericho, perhaps, but it's about 20 metres long by 16 metres wide, and you can see that There's a big sort of interior space with various division markers within it, a big trough running through the centre, and then there are tiers of benches going up the sides. And the faces of the benches are decorated and redecorated several times with new layers of plaster put on them and different forms of decoration. So we've got some large building here, which may be related to some sort of food processing activity. You could maybe just make up the whole there of the cup, whole mortar, and there's another one on the other side, just where they're squatting. So perhaps it's something to do with food processing again, perhaps it's some sort of large structure where everybody gets together and does harvest processing. It does seem to have some sort of performance role with the way the benches tier up around the edges and producing this central sort of theatrical space. But at the moment we're still doing analysis on all the material from the floor horizons and so on. But it's something entirely new to us. In an interesting way, in the PPNA, nearly every site has got something entirely new to us when we go to it. Something that we've not encountered before. They are all very different. There's a feeling you get almost of experimentation going on. That, in a way, Child's idea of the Neolithic Revolution actually has some element of real truth in it. That people are consciously experimenting with things. The store buildings with their raised floors, that's a design. Somebody's actually thought of that and done it. It's not a slow process of adaptation of what's gone before. Somebody's actually seen a problem and addressed it. There is thought and invention going on, and it's very local. People are building their own communities. Each community is different. You can see that they're not, the West Bank is different from the south of Jordan, and each site in the south of Jordan is different from each other site in the south of Jordan. You can see this is very different from the site of Jordan. I've covered all this already. I think that's just a reminder of the different sort of features you get in this large building. So at W16, because we've excavated maybe almost a half of this site, we've got a very good idea of the overall layout of it. But there seems to be an area for performance overlooking the wadi. We've got workshops built around that. You can see there's other small structures going in an arc around it. And then we've got the storage building, and we've possibly got a residence down there. So not the sort of traditional village, and not like the sites on the West Bank, the older excavations. As we move on, and I mentioned the site of El Hema earlier on, halfway between Jar and W16, there are other special forms of building. Here there's a building which appears to be a mortuary structure with a large number of burials set in the floor of it. And the burials are all quite interesting and elaborate, a lot of them stone-lined with little benches in them for people to be put into the burial, sitting up. You can see this person was sitting up and they've actually slumped down at some point. And again, as at Fanan in the early burial, that's not the end of the life of the structure. These things are probably protruding slightly from the ground. It's almost like the one sitting up may even have been able to see out. And once they collapse, then there is mud plaster poured into them, so their feet are all caked in mud plaster, and then they're neatly sealed with these sort of slabs over the top. So there's an ongoing process again. It doesn't look like people are just dead and buried once. So it's a part of the community's life cycle. Now, I mentioned the two sites of Beda and Shkaret Mazad. That's that site showing you Beda in its little local landscape, this very dense settlement there, and a little bit extra outside the settlement, which I'll show you more in a moment. And we've done various reconstructions to experiment with how they were built, and the difficulty of burning them down, because quite a number of them have been burned down, and they are very, very difficult to destroy by fire. I mean, mud and stone with a little bit of wood doesn't burn very easily. So the burning is obviously a very deliberate fact of their existence. And the other thing that's very famous from the Little PPMB, one of the things that came up at the Jericho excavations as well, are these plastered skulls of the Neolithic of the southern Levant, where selected individuals go through various stages of treatment. And depending on the area, this was a map produced by my colleague Ian Kite, where he was trying to look at who's still got their mandible underneath the plaster, where it's been removed. So you've got a lot of very squat faces where they've reconstructed the face, but without the lower jaw. And there are different trends and patterns in different locations. So he was arguing that this is again another thing that's regionally defined. But importantly, it looks like these plastered skull treatments are very much a way of keeping the communities of the southern Levant together. but not south of Dra. The southern part of Jordan has no plastered skulls at all. They're doing something different again there, which doesn't involve this. So one of the hallmarks of the Middle East, these famous plastered skulls, is completely missing from our study area. Sorry. More reconstructions from Beda. So this is the early phase of Beda. There's the wall with the steps up I showed you a photograph of. The bulk of the site in different phases looks like this fairly small, roughly circular structures. And there was, excavated by Darren Kirkbride, what looked like a much, much larger circular structure, which we went back to very recently, and which turned out to be considerably larger than the others, to have several post holes. There's the one we found, that was an older one from the old excavations there, and with a stone floor, not the usual non-plaster floor, but a stone floor, which Darren Kirkbride had identified. It's actually coated with clay, and the clay is worn off in most areas. So a very robust floor, not for ordinary domestic use, we would suggest, with an interior area that's 2 to 3 times the average of the other buildings. So again, we think we're seeing some particular communal structure that's being built for the community to do something in, and something that involves a lot of heavy-duty activity. Whether that they all get in there and get very hot and dance, or whether they're lugging stores around, we don't yet know. But it may be more to do with the ritual dancing type of activity, because they were also taking in carved stone slabs, which they placed down on the floor, and protected bits of the floor from burning. You can see again in this building the dark patches on the remains of the roof which fell in on top of the floor. So there is some here, perhaps ritual element that relates to these stones, but no sign of the plastered skulls. At the nearby site of Shkarat Mazayat, again, there's one building that's considerably larger than the others, perhaps a bit more regularly made, and that one has a lot more things going on in it. You can see that there's all sorts of stone boxes and things, and in one of those, no plastered skulls, and a big collection of skulls, just all crammed in. So this appears to sort of be continuing the sort of mortuary building tradition of the early DNA sites. And again, carved stone slabs, much like the ones at Beda, but better preserved because they haven't had a burning roof collapse on top of them, and with very similar sort of marks and traces of working. So suggesting that the two communities, which are about 10 kilometres apart, are in close contact. They know what each other are doing, but they're doing them slightly differently, following on this trend for extreme sort of independence of the way they were setting up their villages. I said, when I showed you the overall photograph of Beda, that there was one bit off to the side that was different, and this is part of it. And you can see here we have a very different structure. It's got a big upright stone slab in the middle. It's got a big stone basin in the wall there, upright stones in the walls. Just outside, a huge shallow basin made out of stone, one big piece of stone, and there are a couple of other little structures just next to it. And it looks here as if we have, in some way, got some sort of ritual building just outside the settlement, where people are actually beginning to allocate yet another special purpose sort of structure. Now, just getting into the lake, PPMB briefly. Here we are, this is the population explosion. Sites everywhere, not all of them extensively excavated. We know quite a lot about the period. And it's important to note that this is a basement. You're looking at all the basement floors, and you can see small storage cells, steps coming down into the basement. There are little windows that go in between. There are ventilation shafts that go up inside the walls. Quite sophisticated, sort of climate-controlled storage. And this is what people always said you should have in a farming community. This idea of privacy, where you're bringing your stores inside the house, and then you're actually taking them down to the basement. Nobody can see what you're doing with your stores, and they have to get past you to get to your stores. So you're beginning to see people actually really changing the way they deal with foods and so on. They're no longer in a sort of forced sharing communal situation, but becoming increasingly sort of household-based and closing themselves in. They're also doing more in the way of communal architecture. Here the excavators uncovered part of a stepped street going up through the middle of the settlement. So you're actually seeing quite sophisticated communal construction effort going on by this period. You also get, and this is the village of Basler, just near Petra, and the modern village was built over the Neolithic village, so some rescue excavations were conducted by a German-Jordanian team, and some of the trenches have been kept open. And what you can see here is a very large house with a big courtyard, and then again with small storage cells around it. So the idea that you're getting into a more household-based society, more the sort of idea of the village society than not aware. And here are some photographs of the site in detail. You can see, again, the windows, and you're now, the walls are really high. These are two-storey buildings, quite elaborate and quite complicated, long before anybody really expected this sort of thing to exist. You can see that's a very large German archaeologist standing at the top, and you can see these walls are 2 or 3 times as height. And just there you can see steps going down into the inside of these buildings. And they seem to some extent, what they've done here is that although they have 2 stories, they go up higher than that, because as time goes by, they let the bottom floors fill in. They start using the next layer up as the storage basement and subdivide it into compartments, and then they'll build up again. So the site is actually building up in a very dynamic way upwards. And finally, leaving the south of Jordan, because apart from the site of Bela, we don't have these in the south of Jordan. This is Am Ghazal in Amman, where Gary Rolson excavated a very large site called the Zeban Kafafi, another one of these late Libyan sites. And here you can see what he described as a temple. It's a large rectilinear building with an altar at one end, and indeed what you see as a temenos wall running around it. So here we are in the late Libyan, at the very beginning of when we can start to say that farming is actually happening. And there's still quite a long way to go in some of the domestication processes, and the proportion of these domestic resources that people rely on is still not 100%, but already the communities have become deeply constructed with all sorts of corporate collective architecture, and possibly, although there's a lot of argument about this still, the beginnings of much more formalised religion, and at least the collective will to build structures that are entirely related to the communal well-being of the site rather than its economic benefit. So I think that's everything I wanted to say, and I hope that has made the point that all of this that I've shown you tonight happens before the Neolithic people really become farmers. We've got thousands and thousands of years where what they're doing primarily seems to be actually constructing the communities that then require the intensification of food production to go alongside to sustain them. And by the time you've got to the late PPNB here, they've probably almost become unsustainable because the settlements have become so big, several thousand people living in one place with a fairly basic form of farming, but keeping those people together is the absolute priority, and they keep these going long beyond what you might think sensible or reasonable. They must be travelling considerable distances to gather enough food to bring into these settlements. So the driving force very much building the community, and literally with all their architectural work building it. Okay, thank you.